What happens when a routine traffic stop turns into a life-altering confrontation? In a small town rife with prejudice, a white cop detains an unassuming black man, unaware of the extraordinary power he wields. As tensions rise and the truth slowly emerges, will justice prevail, or will the system once again falter under the weight of its biases? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will leave you inspired. Officer Derek Matthews adjusted his belt as he slid into the driver's seat of his cruiser, his mood as dull as the overcast skies outside. Another day, another uneventful patrol in Riverton, a town that prided itself on tradition but bore the scars of simmering racial tension. Derek had been with the department for 8 years, his reputation a patchwork of commendations and complaints. He considered himself just doing his job, though others might say his brand of policing was fueled by snap judgments and a heavy hand. As he turned the key, the police radio crackled to life with a dispatch update about a stolen vehicle reported 2 towns over. Derek barely listened, his mind already forming the assumptions he carried like second nature. Probably another kid joyriding, he muttered to himself as he steered onto the main road. Meanwhile, James Carter navigated his modest sedan down the same stretch of road, his demeanor calm but alert. A tall, lean man in his mid-40s, James wore a black hoodie and jeans, blending seamlessly into the background of roadside diners and gas stations. It was intentional. Though his position as director of the CIA demanded a commanding presence in Washington's corridors of power, he relished moments like this when he could shed the trappings of his title and simply be a man driving home. James was on a rare break from the chaos of his high-stakes role, his destination a small town in Alabama where his mother still lived in the same house he'd grown up in. It was a pilgrimage he made once a year, and this time he chose to drive rather than fly, craving the solitude and the chance to reconnect with the land he still called home. He glanced at the dashboard, low on gas. Spying a station a quarter-mile ahead, James slowed and turned into the lot, parking at a pump that had clearly seen better days. The rusted sign overhead proclaimed Pete's Gas Mart open 24/7. James stepped out and stretched briefly before pulling his wallet from his back pocket. As he moved, he noticed the watchful gaze of a teenage attendant lounging by the window, chewing gum and scrolling on his phone. James offered a polite nod before sliding his credit card into the pump. Unbeknownst to James, his presence had already caught someone else's attention. Derek Matthews' cruiser rolled past Pete's Gas Mart just as James swiped his card. From the corner of his eye, Derek spotted him, a black man wearing a hoodie and driving what appeared to be a newer model sedan. Derek slowed instinctively, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as his mind churned through years of ingrained assumptions. "That's not a local," he muttered, pulling his cruiser into the lot and parking near the store's entrance. He didn't step out right away. Instead, he observed James as he began fueling his car. No sudden movements. No suspicious behavior. Yet to Derek, that was the problem. James looked too calm, too composed. It didn't sit right with him. Derek's fingers drummed the steering wheel as his imagination filled in the blanks. Maybe the man's car was stolen, maybe he had drugs in the trunk, or maybe he was just one of those types passing through town with no respect for its order. He wasn't sure yet, but he intended to find out. Inside the gas station, the teenage attendant, Ryan, noticed the patrol car through the smudged window. His grip on his phone tightened. Like many in Riverton, Ryan had grown up hearing stories about Officer Matthews, some heroic, others not so much. Ryan had witnessed a few of the latter. When James stepped into the store to grab a bottle of water, Ryan greeted him with a cautious smile. "Need anything else?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. James, polite as always, shook his head. "Just the water, thanks." As James handed over a crisp $5 bill, Ryan hesitated. "Sir, just a heads up, the cop out there, he's kind of intense." James raised an eyebrow, then turned to glance through the window. Derek was sitting in the cruiser, his face partially obscured by the glare on the windshield. "Thanks for the warning," James said evenly, pocketing his change and walking out with his water. As James returned to his car, Derek finally stepped out of his cruiser. His posture was rigid, his thumbs hooked into his belt as he approached. "Evening," Derek said curtly, his eyes scanning James up and down. "You from around here?" James kept his tone neutral, sensing the undercurrent of suspicion in Derek's voice. just passing through. Derek's gaze flicked to James' car. Nice ride. You own that. James nodded. Yes. Derek took a half step closer, his hand resting casually near his holster. Mind if I see some ID? James' jaw tightened, but he reached into his back pocket, pulling out his driver's license. He handed it over without a word, his expression impassive as Derek scrutinized the card. James Carter. Derek read aloud, the name rolling off his tongue as if searching for significance. He glanced at James' address. Virginia, huh? Long way from home. James didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching Derek with a calm that only seemed to agitate the officer further. What brings you to Riverton? Derek pressed. Just visiting family, James replied evenly. Derek's eyes narrowed. You don't sound too chatty. Got something to hide? James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. No, officer. Just trying to get back on the road. Derek stared at him for another beat before handing back the license. But rather than letting James leave, he gestured toward the car. Pop the trunk for me. James folded his arms, his calm veneer cracking slightly. Am I being detained? Derek's jaw tightened. You're being questioned. That wasn't my question, James replied, his voice steady but firm. Am I being detained? The air between them grew thick with tension. Derek wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already decided was guilty of something. His fingers twitched near his belt, a reflex born of years on the force. Sir, either cooperate, or I'll have to assume you're obstructing justice, Derek said, his voice low and threatening. James held his ground, his eyes locked on Derek's. I'm well aware of my rights, Officer Matthews. If you have probable cause, say so. If not, I'd like to leave. The mention of his name startled Derek. He hadn't introduced himself. His eyes darted to the name badge pinned to his uniform, then back to James. How do you know my name? James didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back toward his car, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Derek's hand shot out, gripping James' arm. I'm not done here. At that moment, the sound of a phone camera clicking broke through the charged silence. Both men turned to see Ryan standing at the gas station window, his phone raised. The teenager quickly ducked out of sight, but the damage was done. Let me go, James said firmly, his voice as sharp as glass. For a split second, Derek hesitated. Then, with a frustrated grunt, he released James and took a step back. You have a good night, he said, though his tone dripped with anything but goodwill. James climbed into his car, his movement steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Derek return to his cruiser. He had a feeling this wasn't over. And he was right. This was only the beginning. James Carter drove away from Pete's Gas Mart, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. He had encountered his share of tense moments in his career, both in the field and behind a desk, but something about Officer Matthews lingered in his mind like a shadow creeping along the edge of his thoughts. The road stretched ahead, flanked by dark woods on both sides. Occasionally an old farmhouse or a faded sign for a diner broke the monotony, but for the most part, it was miles of nothingness. James took a deep breath, trying to shake off the encounter. Still, the faint glow of headlights in his rearview mirror stirred a nagging suspicion. The lights grew closer, and James realized it was the same police cruiser. His jaw clenched as the car accelerated, closing the distance between them before the inevitable flash of red and blue lights filled the night. James pulled to the shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he came to a stop. He placed his hands on the steering wheel and waited, exhaling slowly to steady his nerves. Seconds later, Derek Matthews' silhouette appeared in the side mirror, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The officer approached with deliberate slowness, his posture rigid, and his hand hovering near his belt. James didn't need to look to know what was holstered there. Evening again, Derek said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. The flashlight's beam danced across James' face, lingering just a moment too long before shifting to the interior of the car. You in a hurry? James kept his tone calm. Not at all, officer. Is there a reason I've been pulled over? Derek stepped closer, the leather of his utility belt creaking as he leaned in. "Your taillight's out," he said flatly. James raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't out when I checked it earlier." "Well, it's out now," Derek shot back, his gaze narrowing. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle." James hesitated, considering his options. He knew from experience that compliance often de-escalated these situations, but he also understood the fine line between cooperation and capitulation. Every movement he made would be scrutinized, every word dissected for perceived defiance. "Am I being detained?" he asked again, his voice steady but firm. Derek's lips curled into a tight smirk. "You're being investigated. Now step out of the car." With measured precision, James unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the door open, stepping onto the gravel with his hands clearly visible. He stood tall, his calm demeanor unshaken, even as Derek circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Hands on the hood," Derek ordered, his flashlight now fixed on James' chest. James complied, his palms pressing against the cool metal. He felt the weight of Derek's scrutiny, the officer's eyes crawling over him in search of anything that could justify this unwarranted stop. "You got any weapons on you?" Derek asked, his tone sharp. "No." "Drugs? Anything illegal?" "No." Derek's hands patted James down with methodical precision, the routine invasive and deliberate. Finding nothing, he stepped back and gestured toward the car. "Pop the trunk." James turned to face him, his expression composed but resolute. "You don't have probable cause, officer. I've already shown you my license. If there's an issue with my taillight, I'll be happy to address it, but unless you're charging me with something, I'd like to be on my way." Derek's nostrils flared, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. The tension in the air was electric, the unspoken standoff crackling like static. "You think you're pretty slick, don't you?" he hissed, using all that legal jargon. "It's not jargon," James replied evenly. "It's the law." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment Derek's composure faltered. He was used to submission, to people scrambling to appease him. But this man, this calm, articulate man, wasn't playing by the rules Derek had come to expect. Just as the silence threatened to boil over, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention. A silver sedan pulled up a few yards away, and a woman stepped out, her phone already recording. "Is everything okay here?" she called, her voice laced with a mix of curiosity and concern. Derek turned sharply, his irritation palpable. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. I suggest you move along." The woman didn't budge. "I think I'll stay. Just in case." James suppressed a small smile. It was a small act of defiance, but it shifted the balance of power ever so slightly. Derek scowled, his face twisting with frustration as he realized he was being watched. "Fine," he snapped, stepping back. "You're free to go." James straightened, his movements deliberate, as he opened the car door and slid back into the driver's seat. He didn't bother with a parting glance as he pulled back onto the road, the woman's phone still trained on Derek as his cruiser faded into the distance. James drove in silence, his mind racing despite the calm facade he maintained. He knew men like Derek Matthews, men who wore their authority like armor but wielded it as a weapon. This wouldn't be the end of it. Derek wasn't the type to let something go, especially when his ego was bruised. Still, James had no intention of altering his plans. He was headed home, and no overzealous officer was going to deter him. Up ahead, the lights of a small diner flickered in the distance, its neon sign casting a warm glow against the darkened landscape. James pulled into the lot, craving a moment to collect himself before continuing his journey. The place was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple in a corner booth and a waitress wiping down the counter. As James stepped inside, the waitress looked up and offered a tired smile. "Sit wherever you like." He chose a booth near the window, the faint hum of conversation from the elderly couple providing a soothing backdrop. When the waitress approached, he ordered a cup of coffee, black, and a slice of pecan pie. The warm aroma of the coffee was a welcome reprieve from the tension that had knotted in his chest. James sipped slowly, letting the bitterness ground him as he watched the occasional car pass by on the highway. Meanwhile, back in his cruiser, Derek Matthews fumed. The encounter at the gas station had been bad enough, but the interruption on the roadside was a humiliation he couldn't shake. The presence of the woman with the camera felt like an indictment, her unspoken judgment pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Derek's radio crackled, interrupting his thoughts. It was dispatch, reporting a minor traffic accident a few miles away. He responded tersely, his frustration bleeding into his voice as he turned onto the highway. But even as he followed the call, his mind kept circling back to James Carter. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. The calm, the confidence, the refusal to cower. Derek's gut told him there was more to James than met the eye, and his instincts, flawed as they often were, demanded answers. As he approached the scene of the accident, Derek made a silent vow he wasn't done with James Carter. Not yet. James Carter returned to the road, his composure steady despite the unnerving encounter with Officer Derek Matthews. His years of experience navigating high-stakes situations had taught him how to suppress the emotions that roiled beneath the surface. Still, he couldn't ignore the uneasy weight of the night pressing on him. Something about Derek Matthews didn't feel like it was over. As the miles slipped by, James' thoughts wandered to the reason for his trip. His mother, Patricia Carter, a retired schoolteacher, had lived in Riverton her entire life. While James had risen through the ranks of the intelligence world, Riverton remained his anchor, a place of simpler days and grounding love. But even there, the shadows of systemic bias were inescapable. Patricia had often hinted at how the town's dynamics hadn't changed much since James left, how the same prejudices still lingered, simmering just below the surface. A few miles back, Derek Matthews sat in his cruiser, idling at the edge of the diner's parking lot. The accident dispatch had been a minor fender bender, two frustrated drivers exchanging details under his cursory supervision. It was routine, dull, and only added to his irritation. His thoughts churned with the unresolved tension from earlier. The man in the black sedan had slipped through his fingers, but Derek's gut told him there was more to uncover. It wasn't just the man's confidence, it was his presence, calm, commanding, like someone used to being in control. Derek couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that James was hiding something. Maybe it was arrogance, or maybe it was the subtle challenge James had posed by invoking his rights so effortlessly. Either way, it gnawed at him. Derek punched the license plate number into his onboard computer, hoping to find any reason to justify another encounter. When nothing flagged, he scowled at the screen, his hand tapping impatiently against the console. "All right, Carter," he muttered under his breath. "Let's see if you're as clean as you seem." James' headlights illuminated a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Riverton, a place to call home." He knew he was close, only 20 minutes from his mother's house. His shoulders began to relax at the thought of seeing her, of her warm embrace and the smell of her freshly baked cornbread filling the air. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. In the distance, he saw it again, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights. A sinking feeling gripped James as he pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. This time he knew it wasn't a coincidence. As the cruiser pulled in behind him, his earlier composure wavered slightly. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost midnight. Derek Matthews stepped out of his cruiser, his flashlight once again slicing through the darkness. His demeanor was sharper now, his movements brisk and charged with an air of authority. As he approached the car, James took another deep breath, preparing for yet another verbal sparring match. "Evening," Derek said curtly, shining the light into James' car. "We meet again." James rested his hands on the steering wheel, his tone measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" Derek tilted his head, his smirk barely visible in the dim light. "Funny thing, I noticed you didn't signal when you switched lanes back there. Thought I'd check it out." James resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "I see." "License and registration," Derek demanded, his tone clipped. James handed over the documents without protest, his every movement deliberate and slow. He knew how quickly things could escalate in situations like this. Derek took the paperwork back to his cruiser, leaving James in tense silence. Minutes dragged on as the officer sat in his car, ostensibly running the documents, though James suspected this was another power play, a deliberate tactic to unsettle him. Finally, Derek returned, his flashlight trained on James' face once more. Mind stepping out of the vehicle. James' brow furrowed. "What for?" "I'm conducting a search," Derek replied, his tone brooking no argument. James stared at him, his frustration barely masked. "Officer, unless you have probable cause." "Step out of the car," Derek interrupted, his voice sharp. For a moment, James considered refusing outright, but he quickly calculated the risks. With a deep sigh, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his hands held slightly away from his sides. "I hope you understand this is a blatant abuse of authority," he said calmly. Derek ignored the comment, motioning for James to stand by the hood of the car. "Hands where I can see them." James complied, his patience wearing thin. Derek began a second pat down, this one more invasive than the first. His hands lingered, his demeanor antagonistic, as though daring James to react. Finding nothing, Derek stepped back and gestured toward the car. "Pop the trunk." James turned to face him, his expression firm. "What are you looking for?" "Drugs, weapons." "Whatever you're hiding," Derek said, his smirk returning. James shook his head, his voice steady. "I'm not hiding anything." "Then pop the trunk," Derek said, his hand hovering near his holster. James held his gaze, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Reluctantly, he moved to the driver's side and pressed the release. The trunk clicked open, and Derek moved quickly to inspect it, shining his flashlight over the contents: a neatly packed suitcase, a laptop bag, and a book on espionage history. Derek frowned, clearly annoyed at the lack of incriminating evidence. He rifled through the suitcase, pulling out neatly folded shirts and slacks. "Traveling light," he muttered, more to himself than to James. "Is this search going to take much longer?" James asked, his tone still calm but edged with impatience. Derek turned to him, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What's the rush? Got somewhere to be." "As a matter of fact, I do," James replied, his gaze unwavering. The two men stood locked in silence, the power dynamic shifting ever so slightly. Derek's bravado faltered, his suspicion now veering into desperation. He slammed the trunk shut and stepped closer to James, his face inches away. "I don't like your attitude." James didn't flinch. "I'm not obligated to adjust my attitude to suit your comfort." Derek's nostrils flared, and for a moment James wondered if the man might actually lash out. But before he could say anything further, the faint glow of headlights appeared on the horizon. A car approached slowly, its occupants likely curious about the commotion on the roadside. The interruption seemed to snap Derek out of whatever brink he was teetering on. He stepped back, his smirk returning as he pointed a finger at James. "You watch yourself," he said, his voice low. "Next time I might not be so patient." James didn't respond. He simply returned to his car, his movements deliberate and controlled. As he drove away, he caught sight of Derek in his rearview mirror, the officer standing by the roadside, his figure framed by the swirling red and blue lights. As James continued down the road, his mind raced. The encounter was more than just an inconvenience, it was a stark reminder of how men like Derek Matthews wielded power as a weapon, unchecked and unchallenged. James' training had taught him to analyze threats, to assess risks, and to respond strategically. But tonight he felt the weight of a different kind of threat, one that couldn't be neutralized with tactics or strategy alone. He thought about his mother waiting for him, about the town he had left behind but never truly escaped. For the first time in years, James felt a flicker of doubt. Was he walking into a place where change was even possible, or was he destined to confront the same walls of prejudice that had loomed over him since childhood? As the distant lights of Riverton came into view, James made a quiet vow this wasn't over, not for him, and not for Derek Matthews. Derek Matthews sat in his cruiser, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. He watched the red taillights of James Carter's sedan fade into the distance, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Men like Carter, smooth, composed, and defiant, always thought they were untouchable. Derek couldn't stand it. He radioed dispatch. "This is Officer Matthews. I need a records check on a James Carter, Virginia license plate Echo, Victor 753 Lima Hotel." There was a pause before the operator responded. "Copy that, Matthews. Stand by." Derek tapped his fingers against the console, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was this guy? A lawyer? A federal agent? He hadn't reacted like an ordinary traveler. There was something about his calmness, the precision of his words. It wasn't just confidence, it was training. The dispatcher's voice crackled back over the radio. No priors, no outstanding warrants. Vehicle is registered to James Carter, same address as his license. Nothing unusual. Derek frowned. That wasn't the answer he wanted. Thanks, dispatch, he muttered, clicking off the radio. His irritation deepened. If Carter wasn't hiding anything, then why had he been so difficult? James Carter drove the last few miles into Riverton, his thoughts focused on what had just transpired. He wasn't afraid of Derek Matthews, but he was acutely aware of the risks. Men like Derek didn't stop until they found or fabricated a reason to justify their actions. James had seen it before, countless times in his role as CIA director, when gathering intelligence meant sifting through the ugly realities of local law enforcement across the country. Tonight had been no different. James glanced at his phone mounted on the dashboard. It buzzed with a text message from his assistant, Miranda. Update meeting confirmed with SEC. Wallace on Tuesday. Intel brief attached. Call if urgent. James let out a small sigh. He'd hoped to get through this weekend without being pulled back into work, but there was no rest in his line of duty. His thoughts shifted to his mother, Patricia. She was expecting him by now, probably pacing in her kitchen with worry. Patricia Carter had raised him to stand tall, to fight for justice, but also to choose his battles carefully. Tonight, James felt the weight of her lessons, as though she were whispering them to him from miles away. As he turned onto her street, the sight of her modest home painted in pale yellow with white shutters brought him a sense of calm. The porch light was on, and the faint outline of her figure was visible through the front window. James parked in the driveway and stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his face. Before he could reach the door, Patricia opened it, her expression both relieved and sharp. "James, what took you so long? I was starting to worry." James forced a smile as he climbed the steps. "It's good to see you too, Mom." She hugged him tightly, her arms still strong despite her years. "I mean it," she said, pulling back to study his face. "You look tired. What happened?" James hesitated. He didn't want to burden her with the details, but her piercing gaze made it clear that evasion wasn't an option. "I had a little run-in with the local cop," he admitted, stepping into the house. Patricia's expression darkened. "A run-in? What do you mean?" James shrugged, trying to downplay it. "He pulled me over. Twice, actually. Nothing serious. Just one of those routine checks." Patricia's hands went to her hips. "Routine, my foot. Let me guess, white officer, middle-aged, probably looked at you like you didn't belong." James gave a faint nod. "Something like that." She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's the same old story around here, James. These men have been playing that game since before you were born. They don't like seeing anyone who doesn't fit their mold, especially not someone who carries themselves like you do." James didn't argue. Instead, he sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table as Patricia busied herself making tea. He watched her move, her steps deliberate but still light. For all her sternness, she was a woman of grace, someone who had faced life's challenges head-on and never lost her dignity. She set a steaming cup in front of him and took a seat across the table. "You know you can't just let this go, right?" James raised an eyebrow. "And what would you suggest I do?" Patricia leaned forward, her voice low but resolute. "Whatever you can. You're not some ordinary citizen, James. You've got power. Influence. Use it." James sipped his tea, the warmth easing some of his tension. "I'll think about it, Mom. But for now, I just want to focus on being here." Patricia reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "I understand, baby. But remember, you're here for more than just a visit. This town needs people like you to remind them that things can change." Derek Matthews spent the next hour parked outside the precinct, scrolling through his phone in search of anything that could explain James Carter's composed demeanor. He sifted through social media, news articles, even online databases, but nothing connected the man to anything suspicious. Frustrated, he leaned back in his seat, his mind replaying the events of the night. Carter's calmness wasn't natural. It was practiced. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Just as Derek considered calling it a night, his phone buzzed with a text from his partner, Officer Reed. "Heard about the guy you pulled over. Any fireworks?" Derek smirked, his fingers flying across the screen. Not yet. But I'm keeping tabs. Guy thinks he's untouchable. Reed responded quickly. Careful, Matthews. People are recording everything these days. Don't need another incident. Derek frowned, his irritation flaring. I know what I'm doing. This guy's not just passing through, I'll figure it out. Reed didn't reply, leaving Derek alone with his thoughts. The night felt heavier now, the silence pressing in around him. But Derek wasn't ready to back down. James Carter had struck a nerve, and Derek wasn't the type to let that go. Back at Patricia's house, James stood in the small backyard, gazing up at the stars. The night was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of cars on the highway. He let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing as the stillness enveloped him. But even as he stood there, the events of the night replayed in his mind. Derek Matthews was a problem not just for James, but for anyone who crossed his path. Men like him thrived on unchecked authority, their actions justified by a system that turned a blind eye. James reached for his phone and opened an encrypted messaging app. He composed a brief message to one of his senior intelligence officers. Need a background check on a local officer, Derek Matthews, Riverton, Alabama. Priority low. Send findings to personal inbox. He hesitated for a moment before hitting send, the weight of his decision settling over him. This wasn't just about him. It was about the larger issue of accountability, of ensuring that men like Derek couldn't abuse their power without consequences. As the message sent, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just visiting Riverton to see his mother. He was here to make a difference, however small. And Derek Matthews had just given him the perfect reason to start. The morning sun rose over Riverton, casting its golden glow across the small town. The sleepy streets began to stir as shopkeepers unlocked their doors and neighbors exchanged greetings. Patricia Carter's kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon as she hummed a hymn under her breath. But James Carter was already awake, seated at the dining table with his laptop open. His eyes scanned the report that had just arrived in his encrypted inbox. The background check on Officer Derek Matthews was damning. Several complaints of misconduct, allegations of racial profiling, and multiple use of force incidents, all swept under the rug by internal reviews. None had resulted in disciplinary action. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about his run-ins with Derek, this was a pattern, a reflection of a broken system that had allowed someone like him to thrive unchecked. Morning, baby Patricia greeted, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. She glanced at the laptop screen, her brow furrowing. What's all that? James closed the screen gently, offering her a reassuring smile. Just some work. Patricia didn't buy it. She crossed her arms and gave him the look one James had grown up respecting, even fearing. Work, huh? This wouldn't have anything to do with that officer you mentioned last night. James sighed. It's nothing to worry about, Mom. Patricia sat down across from him, her expression firm. James, you've got that look. The one you get when you're about to take on something bigger than yourself. I know you mean well, but you need to be careful. This town doesn't take kindly to people stirring the pot. James reached for her hand, his tone soft but resolute. Someone has to, Mom. Derek Matthews isn't just a bad cop, he's dangerous. And he's not the only one. If no one speaks up, nothing will change. Patricia's face softened, but worry lingered in her eyes. Just promise me you'll be smart about it. James nodded. I will. At the Riverton police station, Derek Matthews strode into the bullpen with his usual swagger. The events of the previous night still lingered in his mind, but his confidence hadn't wavered. He tossed his hat onto his desk and reached for the stack of reports waiting for him, his mind already dismissing James Carter as an annoyance rather than a threat. But the atmosphere in the station felt different. His colleagues exchanged glances as he passed, their whispers quiet but noticeable. Derek frowned, his gaze narrowing as he approached his desk. A printed article sat neatly atop the pile of paperwork, its headline bold and unmistakable. Racial profiling in Riverton, a pattern of abuse under Officer Derek Matthews. Derek's jaw tightened as he skimmed the article. It detailed his record, every complaint, every accusation, all laid bare for public scrutiny. The byline listed no name, only anonymous, but the timing left no doubt in his mind. James Carter. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his chest tightening with anger. Before he could act, his captain, a gruff man in his 50s named Captain Reynolds, called out from his office. "Matthews, my office. Nigh office. Now." Derek tossed the crumpled article onto his desk and stalked toward the captain's office, his boots echoing loudly against the tile floor. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "What's this about, Cap?" Derek asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. He gestured to the article sitting on his desk, identical to the one Derek had just read. "You tell me. I've got reporters calling me, city council breathing down my neck, and now this lands on my desk. Care to explain?" Derek crossed his arms. "It's all lies. Just someone trying to make me look bad." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Is it? Because if even half of this is true, we've got a serious problem." Derek's fists clenched at his sides. "You've had my back before. Why are you doubting me now?" "Because this isn't just going away," Reynolds said, his voice rising. "The mayor's calling for an investigation. They're bringing in an external review board." Derek's face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt. You know how these people are, they'll say anything to make a cop look bad." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Be very careful with your words, Matthews. This department's reputation is already on the line, and you're not making it any better." Derek glared at him, his chest heaving. "So that's it? You're throwing me under the bus?" Reynolds leaned forward, his voice cold. "No, Derek. I'm telling you to get your act together. If this investigation finds anything concrete, you're on your own." Derek stormed out of the office, his mind a whirlwind of anger and paranoia. He needed to regain control of the narrative, and he knew exactly where to start. Meanwhile, James sat in Patricia's living room, a steaming cup of coffee in hand as he fielded calls from his contacts. The article had been his first step, a calculated move to expose Derek's record without revealing his own involvement. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Accountability required more than just public outrage, it needed action. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Miranda, his assistant. He answered quickly. "Miranda, what do you have?" "We pulled additional intel on Matthews," she said. "He's been involved in several incidents of questionable force, but none of them were properly investigated. We flagged him to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." James nodded. "Good, keep me updated. And Miranda, keep this off the radar, no leaks." "Understood, sir," she replied before ending the call. James leaned back in his chair, the pieces of his plan beginning to take shape. But before he could dwell on it, Patricia appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You've got company," she said, her voice tinged with concern. James frowned, standing as she stepped aside to reveal Derek Matthews standing on the porch, his expression dark. James felt his chest tighten, but he masked it with a calm demeanor. "Officer Matthews," James said, stepping onto the porch. "What brings you here?" Derek's eyes narrowed. "Cut the act, Carter. I know you're behind that article." James tilted his head slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games with me," Derek growled. "You think you're clever digging up dirt on me? Trying to ruin my career?" James remained unfazed. "If there's dirt to dig, officer, maybe the problem isn't the digging." Derek stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You don't scare me, Carter. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not." James met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither are you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Derek's fists clenched, but before he could respond, Patricia's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough," she said firmly, stepping onto the porch. Her presence was commanding, her tone brooking no argument. "Officer, if you have a warrant, you're welcome to present it. If not, I suggest you leave." Derek glanced between them, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he turned and stalked back to his cruiser, his frustration evident in every step. As the car disappeared down the street, Patricia turned to James. "You've made yourself a target, son." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. Now he knows I'm watching." The fallout from James Carter's calculated actions rippled through Riverton like a tidal wave. By mid-morning, the article exposing Derek Matthews' history of misconduct had become the town's hottest topic. On social media, the hashtags #RivertonJustice and Derek Matthews trended locally, fueled by accounts of residents who had experienced similar encounters with the officer. Stories of racial profiling, verbal harassment, and aggressive stops began to emerge, painting a picture far uglier than even James had anticipated. For the first time in years, the town's veneer of order cracked under the weight of its own secrets. At the Riverton police station, the atmosphere was tense and uneasy. Officers moved through the bullpen with hushed voices, their glances darting toward Derek Matthews' empty desk. Captain Reynolds, overwhelmed by the media attention and demands for accountability, called an emergency meeting to address the situation. As the officers gathered in the small conference room, Reynolds took his place at the head of the table. His face was a mask of controlled anger, his gruff voice cutting through the murmurs. "Let's get one thing clear," he began. "This department is under scrutiny like never before. Every decision we make, every action we take will be dissected by the public and the press. We can't afford to make mistakes." A younger officer, visibly nervous, raised his hand. "Captain, what about Matthews? Is he being put on leave?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Effective immediately, Officer Matthews is suspended pending an external investigation." The room buzzed with whispers, but Reynolds silenced them with a glare. "I don't care how long he's been on the force or what favors he thinks he's owed. If there's truth to these allegations, he's done." For Derek, the suspension was both humiliating and infuriating. He sat in his small apartment, the blinds drawn, as he watched news coverage of the scandal unfold. His name was plastered across headlines, his face replayed on local broadcasts. The public outrage was palpable, and the silence from his colleagues was deafening. Derek clenched his fists, his mind spinning. He wasn't just angry, he felt betrayed. For years, his methods had been overlooked, even condoned. Now, the same system that had protected him was casting him aside, and he knew exactly who to blame. At Patricia Carter's home, James sat in the living room, his phone buzzing incessantly with updates. Miranda's voice came through the line, crisp and efficient. "Sir, the Department of Justice is officially reviewing the Riverton Police Department," she said. "The Civil Rights Division is prioritizing Matthews' case, but they're also examining broader systemic issues." James nodded. "Good. Make sure they dig deep. This can't just be about one man." "Understood," Miranda replied before hanging up. James set his phone down and glanced out the window. The neighborhood was quiet, but he couldn't ignore the weight of the stares he'd felt when he stepped outside earlier. Riverton was small, and word traveled fast. While many applauded his actions, others, those who viewed Derek Matthews as a symbol of authority, were less forgiving. Patricia walked into the room, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. She set it on the table and sat beside James, her expression thoughtful. "How long do you plan to stay here?" James hesitated. "Until I'm sure this investigation takes root." She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've stirred something powerful, James. That officer won't take this lying down. Neither will the people who see him as their last line of defense against a world they don't understand." "I'm not afraid of Derek Matthews," James said firmly, "and I'm not stopping until accountability becomes more than a buzzword." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know you're doing what's right. Just don't lose sight of why you're here." James nodded, her words grounding him. "I won't." Meanwhile, Derek wasn't sitting idle. He pored over the article, dissecting every line, convinced that James Carter was behind it. The cryptic byline didn't fool him. Derek knew the man's demeanor, his calculated confidence. This wasn't the work of a journalist, it was personal. Derek made calls, reaching out to old contacts, desperate for information that could give him leverage. Most refused to engage, unwilling to be associated with him amid the growing scandal. But one old acquaintance, a private investigator named Carl, agreed to help. "Find me everything you can on James Carter," Derek demanded over the phone. "Background, history, skeletons, anything." Carl hesitated. "Derek, you sure about this? The guy's got connections. You dig too deep, you might end up on the wrong side of the spotlight." "I don't care," Derek snapped. "Just do it." Carl agreed reluctantly, but Derek's impatience was palpable. He wasn't just looking for dirt, he was looking for revenge. The tension in Riverton reached a boiling point that evening when a town hall meeting was called to address the controversy. The community center was packed, the air thick with conflicting emotions. Residents, activists, and local leaders took turns at the microphone, their voices echoing through the crowded hall. "Enough is enough," a middle-aged black man shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "How many more of us have to suffer at the hands of officers like Matthews before something changes?" Applause erupted from one side of the room, while murmurs of dissent rippled through the other. An older white woman stepped up next, her voice quavering as she defended Derek. "He's been an officer in this town for years. He's done more to keep us safe than anyone else. You're all so quick to judge, but none of you know what it's like to walk in his shoes." The room erupted into chaos, voices clashing as the divide between the two factions became starkly clear. James stood at the back of the hall, observing quietly. He felt the weight of the moment, the raw emotions spilling out into the open. This wasn't just about Derek Matthews, it was about the town's soul, about a reckoning long overdue. When the chaos subsided, the moderator invited James to speak. The room fell silent as he stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "My name is James Carter," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to divide this community. I came here because I believe in accountability. I believe in justice not just for the victims of abuse, but for the integrity of the systems we all rely on." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't about one man. It's about all of us. About whether we're willing to stand by and accept a broken system or fight to make it better." A smattering of applause began, growing louder as more people joined in. But the divided room made it clear that not everyone was convinced. As James stepped down, Patricia caught his eye from the crowd. She nodded, her expression a mix of pride and concern. He had done what he could for now. Outside the town hall, Derek sat in his parked car, watching as people filed out. He spotted James in the crowd, walking with Patricia toward her car. Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his chest burning with resentment. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, his mind already plotting his next move. For James, the battle was far from won, but as he climbed into his mother's car and drove away, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The tides of change had begun to shift, and he wasn't about to let them retreat. The air in Riverton crackled with tension, a town now split into two factions. On one side were those demanding change, emboldened by James Carter's revelations and the mounting evidence against Officer Derek Matthews. On the other were Matthews' defenders, residents clinging to the belief that he was a protector wronged by outsiders who didn't understand their way of life. It wasn't just about Derek anymore, it was about a town forced to confront its deep-seated biases, its history, and the cracks in its foundations. In the days following the town hall, the external review team from the Department of Justice arrived in Riverton. Their presence was immediately felt, meticulous investigators poring over records, interviewing officers and residents, and demanding transparency. For many in the Riverton Police Department, it was a reckoning long overdue. Derek Matthews was at the center of it all. His suspension had done little to dim the fire in his chest. If anything, it burned brighter, fueled by anger, paranoia, and a sense of betrayal. He spent his days confined to his small apartment, the blinds drawn, and his phone buzzing with messages from supporters and detractors alike. Carl, the private investigator, finally came through with a report on James Carter. It wasn't much, a spotless public record and a few scattered mentions of his work in government. But one detail caught Derek's attention: Carter's role as director of the CIA. Derek's pulse quickened as he read the words. It explained everything: the composure, the confidence, the resources to expose him, but it also made Derek feel smaller than ever. He wasn't just fighting a man, he was fighting a machine. An institution with power and reach beyond anything he could comprehend. And yet, Derek wasn't the type to back down. Meanwhile, James Carter remained a steady presence in the community. Though he kept a low profile, his influence grew as more residents came forward with their stories. The local newspaper began publishing first-hand accounts of racial profiling and abuse at the hands of Riverton officers, each story adding fuel to the fire of reform. Patricia Carter's home became an unofficial hub for change. Neighbors stopped by to share their thoughts, some offering support, others raising concerns about the backlash James might face. Through it all, Patricia stood by her son, her faith in his mission unwavering. One evening, James met with a group of local activists at the small community center on the outskirts of town. The room was packed, the air thick with determination and anxiety. Among those present was a young black woman named Angela, whose brother had been wrongfully arrested by Matthews 2 years prior. "We've been trying to fight this for years," Angela said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But every time we speak up, they shut us down. They make us feel like we're crazy, like we're the problem." James nodded, his tone calm but resolute. "That's what systems like this are designed to do. They make you doubt yourself, divide you so you can't fight back. But now they're the ones on the defensive. We have the momentum, we just need to keep pushing." An older man in the back of the room spoke up. "What if they push back harder? People like Matthews don't go quietly. This could get ugly." "It already is," James replied, meeting the man's gaze. "But change doesn't come without struggle. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for the next generation." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Slowly, heads began to nod, resolve replacing doubt. The group left that night with a renewed sense of purpose, their steps heavier but more deliberate. For Derek, the walls were closing in. The DOJ investigators had uncovered enough evidence to warrant a full audit of the Riverton Police Department. Internal emails, body cam footage, and incident reports revealed a pattern of neglect and cover-ups that implicated not just Derek but several of his colleagues. Captain Reynolds, under mounting pressure, called a press conference to address the findings. Standing at a podium outside the station, he faced a sea of reporters and cameras, his expression grim. "Effective immediately, Officer Derek Matthews is terminated from the Riverton Police Department," Reynolds announced, his voice steady despite the tension. "The actions uncovered in this investigation do not reflect the values of this department or this community. We are committed to rebuilding trust and ensuring accountability." Derek watched the broadcast from his apartment, his face a mask of rage. The words felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The department had abandoned him, sacrificed him to appease the growing outcry. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered that this was inevitable. He had always known he was walking a thin line, but he never imagined it would snap so publicly. James watched the press conference from Patricia's living room, his expression unreadable. The announcement was a victory, but he knew it was just the beginning. Derek's termination didn't undo the harm he'd caused or address the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. Later that evening, Patricia found James sitting on the back porch, staring up at the stars. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. "You did it, baby. You made them listen." James shook his head. "It's not enough, Mom. One man losing his badge doesn't fix the system." "No, but it's a start," she said. "You've shown people that their voices matter. That's how change begins." James turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You always know what to say." Patricia chuckled. "That's my job." The next day, James attended a community rally in Riverton's main square. Hundreds of residents gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Accountability now." The energy was palpable, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. James stepped up to the microphone, the crowd falling silent as he began to speak. "This isn't just about Derek Matthews," he said, his voice carrying over the square. "It's about every person who's been silenced, every injustice that's been ignored, and every system that's failed to protect the people it's supposed to serve. We can't stop here. We have to keep fighting, not with anger, but with resolve. Together we can build a better future." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. For the first time in years, Riverton felt alive with the possibility of change. Back in his apartment, Derek Matthews stared at the television, the rally broadcasted live. The sight of James Carter speaking to a united community made his stomach churn. He turned off the TV and sat in the silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time, Derek allowed himself to reflect not just on what had happened, but on who he had become. The man staring back at him in the mirror wasn't a hero or a protector. He was someone who had let fear, prejudice, and power consume him. And now he was left to face the consequences. As the rally ended and the crowd dispersed, James stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as people walked away with renewed hope. Patricia joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You've done something amazing, James," she said softly. "But I hope you know this fight isn't just yours to carry. You've given this town the tools it needs. Now it's up to them." James nodded, her words settling over him like a balm. "I know, Mom, but I'll always be here if they need me." As the sun set over Riverton, the town felt different. Not perfect, not healed, but on the path to something better. And for James Carter, that was enough for now. The sun rose over Riverton, casting its light on a town that had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The events of the past few weeks had stirred something in its people, a willingness to confront truths they had long ignored. For some, it was a reckoning with uncomfortable realities. For others, it was the spark of hope that long overdue change was possible. James Carter stood outside Patricia's house, his bags packed and loaded into the trunk of his car. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Patricia leaned against the porch railing, her arms crossed as she watched him with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "You sure you don't want to stay a little longer?" she asked, though she already knew his answer. James smiled. "I'd love to, but you know how it is. Duty calls." She sighed and walked down the steps to stand beside him. "You've done good here, James. Don't ever doubt that." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start, but there's still so much work to do." Patricia reached up to straighten his collar, her voice soft. "Just remember, you're not alone in this. You've planted seeds and now it's up to others to nurture them." James hugged her tightly, the warmth of her embrace grounding him. "Thanks, Mom, for everything." As he pulled away, Patricia smiled. "Go on then, save the world." The drive out of Riverton was quiet, the landscape shifting from small-town charm to open highways. James allowed himself a moment of reflection, the memories of the past weeks playing in his mind like a montage. He thought about the people he'd met, the stories they'd shared, and the courage it took for them to stand up and demand justice. The press conference announcing Derek Matthews' termination had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end. The DOJ investigation had uncovered a pattern of systemic abuse, prompting a complete overhaul of the Riverton Police Department. New leadership was being brought in, and a community oversight board was in the works. James knew these changes wouldn't solve everything, but they were tangible steps forward. Back in Riverton, life was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. The rally in the town square had left a lasting impact, igniting a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. Local businesses displayed signs of solidarity in their windows, and community meetings were packed with residents eager to be part of the solution. Angela, the young activist whose brother had been wrongfully arrested, had taken on a leadership role in the newly formed Riverton Justice Alliance. Her voice carried weight now, her determination inspiring others to join the movement. Captain Reynolds, once a staunch defender of the status quo, had resigned under pressure, his departure a symbolic victory for those demanding change. In his place, an interim chief was appointed, a woman named Carla Jenkins, whose reputation for integrity and transparency brought cautious optimism to the town. For Derek Matthews, the world had become much smaller. The once proud officer now spent his days in isolation, his reputation in shreds. The termination from the department had been the final blow, but it was the realization of his own complicity that weighed on him the most. He sat on the edge of his bed, the morning light filtering through the half-closed blinds. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Derek picked up his phone, scrolling through the news. Articles about Riverton's transformation dominated the headlines, each one a reminder of the role he'd played in the town's dark history. For the first time, Derek considered reaching out, not to retaliate, but to apologize. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but the thought lingered, a faint glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: remorse. Weeks later, James received an unexpected email. The sender's name stopped him in his tracks: Derek Matthews. He opened it cautiously, his curiosity tempered by skepticism. Subject: an apology. "James, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this. You were right about everything. I let my fear and anger control me, and I hurt people because of it. I didn't see it before, but now I can't stop seeing it. I don't know if I can fix what I've done, but I want to try. Thank you for opening my eyes, even if it had to be this way. Derek. James stared at the screen, his emotions swirling. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late. But another part, a quieter, more empathetic part, recognized the courage it took to write those words. James didn't reply immediately. Instead, he closed his laptop and stepped outside, the fresh air helping him clear his thoughts. Months passed, and Riverton continued its journey toward transformation. The oversight board was established, community police relations improved, and Angela's organization grew, attracting support from neighboring towns. The story of Riverton became a national example of grassroots reform, a beacon for other communities grappling with similar struggles. James visited occasionally, his presence a reminder of the town's turning point. On one visit, he stood in the town square, watching as children played near a mural that had been painted on one of the old brick buildings. The artwork depicted a tree with deep roots, its branches stretching skyward. Beneath it, the words read, "Justice grows here." Angela approached him, her smile warm. "It's good to see you." "You too," James replied, his gaze still on the mural. "It's beautiful." She nodded. "It's more than that. It's a promise." James turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You've done amazing work here, Angela. This town owes you more than they know." Angela shook her head. "We owe each other. None of this would have happened without you." James smiled faintly. "Maybe, but the real change came from the people who stayed and fought for it." That evening, as James prepared to leave Riverton once again, he stood on Patricia's porch, the stars twinkling above. She joined him, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "You're proud, aren't you?" she asked, her tone playful but sincere. James chuckled. "Maybe a little." "You should be," she said, her voice soft. "What you've done here, it matters." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It does, but there's still so much more to do." Patricia smiled, her pride unmistakable. "Then go do it. And remember, you'll always have a home here." James leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, baby." As James drove away, the lights of Riverton faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the open road ahead. The journey wasn't over. There were more battles to fight, more lives to impact. But for now, he carried with him the knowledge that even the smallest seeds of change could grow into something extraordinary. And in Riverton, those seeds had taken root.